The bright sun was shining on the beachside resort when the nightmare began. A black family, just trying to enjoy their vacation, was suddenly surrounded by police cars. Guns were drawn. Children screamed. The officers claimed they fit the description of criminals they were looking for, but within minutes it became clear this was not about crime, it was about race. What the officers didn't know was that the father, calm and silent through the chaos, was an FBI agent, and he was about to change everything. The summer sun burned brightly over the beachside resort, reflecting off the ocean waves as Marcus Johnson carried his youngest child, 5-year-old Jordan, on his shoulders. The little boy giggled, pointing out at the distant horizon, while his sister Kayla ran ahead with a bucket and shovel, eager to start building sand castles for Marcus and his wife Tasha. This vacation had been a long time coming. Between a demanding job that kept him away for weeks at a time and Tasha's full-time work as a teacher, family trips were rare, and they had promised themselves this one would be special. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen as they walked back toward the parking lot after spending the entire morning on the beach. Their car, a rented black SUV, was parked just a short distance away. Marcus glanced at Tasha and smiled. "I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed," he said. She smiled back, brushing sand from her legs. "I know," she replied. "The kids are actually getting along. The weather's perfect. This might be the best trip we've ever had." But the moment was shattered in an instant. A sharp screech of tires tore through the air as 2 police cars swerved violently into the lot, cutting off their path. The doors flew open, and 4 uniformed officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked, his voice shaking with aggression. Marcus instinctively pulled Jordan down from his shoulders and moved him behind Tasha, his hands raised. Kayla froze in the middle of the path, her eyes wide with terror. "What is going on?" Tasha cried, clutching both children close. "We're just leaving the beach." Her voice was shaking, but she stood firm, shielding the kids with her body. The nearest officer, a tall man with a shaved head and a vein bulging in his neck, ignored her completely. "All of you, down on the ground now," he shouted. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at his family. He knew better than to resist. He slowly lowered himself to the pavement, his palms flat against the rough, sun-baked asphalt. "Sir, please," he said calmly. "My children are here. We're not resisting. Just tell me what this is about." But the officer only responded by yanking his arms behind his back and snapping cold steel cuffs around his wrists. Jordan began crying hysterically. Kayla was shaking so hard she could barely stand Addie. She screamed, trying to run to him, but another officer blocked her path and pushed her backward. Tasha held the children tightly, anger and fear flashing across her face. "We didn't do anything," she pleaded. "We're on vacation. What's wrong with you?" The officers paid no attention. One of them circled the SUV slowly, shining a flashlight into the windows even though the sun was blazing overhead. "Looks like we found our suspects," the man muttered. Marcus, now lying face down on the ground, clenched his jaw. "Suspects of what?" he demanded, still trying to keep his voice calm even as his hands went numb from the cuffs. The shaved-head officer knelt beside him and whispered, "We know who you are. Don't play dumb." Marcus could feel the man's spit hit the side of his face, but he didn't react. He had dealt with men like this before, men who believed their badge gave them the right to strip others of their dignity. "You people are always ready with a story," the officer added with a sneer. That phrase "you people" stabbed at Marcus's gut, but he stayed silent. Around them, bystanders had begun gathering, phones held high, recording every second of the scene. Tasha tried again to show the officers the rental paperwork for the SUV, pulling it from her bag with shaking hands. "It's a rental. You can call the company and confirm it," she said, nearly shouting. But the officer closest to her slapped the papers out of her hand and stepped closer until he was inches from her face. "Step back or I'll arrest you for obstruction," he growled. Kayla let out a terrified sob, clinging to her mother's waist. Marcus could feel his blood boiling, but he bit his tongue. The safety of his family came first. He could fight this later, but for now, he needed to keep them alive. The officers didn't stop at handcuffing Marcus. They separated him from Tasha and the children, placing him roughly into the back seat of a squad car. Through the glass, he could see Jordan crying so hard his tiny body shook. Tasha knelt beside both children, holding them tightly as another officer stood over her, barking orders. Marcus knew what was happening, but the reality still felt like a punch to the chest. They weren't interested in justice. They had seen a black family in a nice car at a nice resort and decided they didn't belong. He took a deep breath, staring at his reflection in the car's plexiglass divider. He was an FBI agent with years of experience, but at that moment he was just another black man in handcuffs, praying his children wouldn't remember this as the day they lost their innocence. The drive to the police station felt like an eternity for Marcus, though it was only 15 minutes. The hum of the engine and the rattle of the metal cage between the back seat and the officers up front drowned out his thoughts for a moment, but each time he looked out the window and saw his children in the second squad car behind him, his chest tightened. Jordan's tear-streaked face was pressed against the window, his tiny hands pawing at the glass as if he could reach his father. Kayla sat stiffly beside her brother, her jaw set in a way Marcus had never seen in his little girl. She was too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to know this was wrong. Tasha sat in the same car as the children, her arms wrapped around them, her face pale but defiant. Marcus knew she was holding herself together for their sake, but he could feel her fear even from a distance. When they arrived at the station, the officers yanked Marcus from the back seat without a word and marched him inside. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hit him as soon as they entered the building, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed harshly, adding to the already suffocating atmosphere. They led him to a small, windowless room with peeling paint, and a metal table bolted to the floor. The cuffs were still cutting into his wrists as they pushed him down into a hard plastic chair. "Stay put," one officer snapped before slamming the door shut. Marcus sat there in silence, forcing himself to breathe slowly, his training kicking in. He'd been on the other side of this table countless times, interrogating suspects, watching their body language, reading their fear, but now, he was the one they treated like a criminal, and the bitter taste of humiliation burned in his mouth. He could hear muffled voices outside the door, followed by the sound of his children crying. In the distance, that was the worst part, not the cuffs, not the way the officers had spoken to him, but knowing that Kayla and Jordan were sitting in some waiting area, scared and confused, wondering if their father was going to be taken away forever after what felt like an hour. The door opened, and the same officer with the shaved head stepped in. He tossed a file onto the table and leaned over Marcus, his voice dripping with false authority. "Here's the deal," he said. "Your car matches the description of a stolen vehicle involved in a robbery last night. 4 suspects, black male, black female, 2 kids. That sound familiar?" Marcus raised his eyes slowly, locking them on the man's face. "We were at a resort 300 miles away last night," he said calmly. "We checked in at 8. You can confirm it with the hotel. The SUV is a rental. You can confirm that too." But the officer just smirked. "Funny how thieves always have the paperwork ready, huh?" Marcus clenched his fists under the table, feeling the edge of the metal dig into his palms. He wanted to tell this man who he really was, flash his badge and watch his smug expression crumble, but his instincts told him to wait. These officers had already made up their minds about him the second they saw his skin color. Revealing his identity now might not protect his family, it might only escalate things further. "I want to see my wife and children," he said instead, his voice low but firm. The officer tilted his head mockingly. "Not how this works, buddy. You answer our questions first." He slid a photo across the table, a grainy image from a gas station camera, showing a group of shadowy figures near a dark SUV that Marcus glanced at the photo briefly. The vehicle in the picture wasn't even the same model as their rental, but he knew pointing that out wouldn't matter. "No," he said simply. The officer stood up, shaking his head as though he'd heard this all before. "We'll see," he muttered, then left the room, slamming the door behind him again. Marcus closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. He could feel the anger rising, but he needed to stay focused. He replayed every detail of the arrest in his mind, the exact words the officers had used, the way they'd ignored Tasha's pleas, the bystanders recording everything. Those recordings might be the only thing that saved them. He thought of the direct line in his phone, the one that would connect him instantly to his FBI supervisor, but they'd taken his phone when they cuffed him. He would have to wait for the right moment. Outside the room, voices grew louder. He recognized Tasha's voice now, sharp and determined, cutting through the noise. "My husband hasn't done anything wrong," she was saying. "I want to know why we're here, and I want to know now." Marcus felt a flicker of pride even as worry gnawed at him. Tasha had always been strong, but he knew the officers wouldn't like being challenged. He sat up straighter, readying himself. Something was about to happen, he could feel it. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest as the muffled sounds outside the interrogation room grew sharper, angrier. He could hear Tasha now more clearly, her voice trembling but strong as she demanded to see her husband. "You have no right to keep us here," she yelled. "My children are terrified and you have no proof we've done anything wrong." The response was a harsh male voice telling her to calm down and stay quiet. Marcus clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body taut with frustration. He could picture Tasha standing in that station lobby, Kayla clutching her hand, Jordan buried in her side, while those same officers who had humiliated him hours earlier tried to intimidate her too. He could practically feel their smirks, their dismissive glances, the way they would be circling her like wolves, waiting for her to slip so they could pounce. He knew Tasha would never break, but that didn't ease the sick feeling twisting in his stomach. He was an FBI agent, trained for high-pressure situations, but nothing in his career had prepared him for watching his family be terrorized. The door to the interrogation room finally swung open, and another officer stepped inside, this one younger, his expression less hardened than the others. He carried a clipboard and kept his eyes down as he addressed Marcus. "We need you to sign a statement," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. Marcus raised his eyebrows. "A statement for what?" The young officer shifted uncomfortably. "Just confirming your presence here and the reason for your detainment." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. I was arrested without cause, and you want me to sign a piece of paper that makes it look justified? The officer hesitated before muttering, "It's just procedure." Marcus's voice dropped cold and controlled. "No, what's your name, officer?" the young man stammered, his Adam's apple bobbing. I'm Officer Daniels." Marcus nodded slowly. "Daniels, I'm going to tell you something, and you need to listen carefully. You and your colleagues are violating the law right now. My wife and children are being traumatized because of your department's incompetence and bias, and when this is over, every one of you will answer for it." Daniel swallowed hard, glancing at the door. Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew the young officer wasn't the one leading this operation. Daniels was simply following orders, caught between fear of his superiors and the nagging sense that what they were doing was wrong. "Can I see my family?" Marcus asked again, his tone firm but not aggressive. Daniels hesitated before nodding slightly. "I'll ask," he said before slipping out of the room. Minutes later, the door opened again, and this time Tasha was there. She looked exhausted, but the moment her eyes locked with Marcus's, a flicker of relief washed over her face. Kayla and Jordan trailed behind her, clinging tightly to her hands. Marcus stood up as far as the cuffs would allow, and the kids rushed forward, wrapping their little arms around his legs. "Daddy," Jordan sobbed. Marcus crouched down as best he could, hugging both children as tightly as the restraints would let him. "I'm right here, babies," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Tasha stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "Marcus, they're not telling me anything. They're saying we fit the description of suspects from a robbery. They keep implying we stole the SUV." Marcus shook his head. "I know. That's the story they're trying to build. But listen to me, we're going to get out of this. I just need you to stay calm for the kids." He looked over her shoulder at Daniels, who was standing nervously in the doorway. "Please uncuff me so I can hold my family properly," Marcus said. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, glancing down the hall before reluctantly pulling a key from his belt. He unlocked the cuffs, and Marcus felt the blood rush back into his hands. He gathered Tasha, Kayla, and Jordan into his arms, holding them close as if he could shield them from everything. For a moment, the noise and fear of the station melted away, and there was only the warmth of his family pressed against him. But the moment ended quickly when the shaved-head officer stormed into the room, his face red with anger. "Who the hell authorized this?" he barked, glaring at Daniels. "Get them separated now." Daniels stepped back, his hands raised slightly. "Sir, maybe we should shut up," the man roared, cutting him off. He turned his glare on Marcus. "You think hugging your family is going to save you? You're going to wish you'd cooperated when you had the chance." Marcus stood tall, shielding his children with his body. His voice was calm but carried a sharp edge. "I've cooperated from the start. You're the one breaking the law, and trust me, that will have consequences." The officer sneered, stepping closer, but before he could speak again, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. A commanding voice called out, "Where is Special Agent Marcus Johnson?" Everyone froze. Marcus's eyes widened slightly as the voice drew nearer. He knew that voice. Help had finally arrived. The air in the room shifted instantly as the commanding voice thundered again from the hallway. "Where is Special Agent Marcus Johnson?" The shaved-head officer froze, his face draining of color as heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed closer and closer. Marcus straightened, one arm wrapped protectively around Jordan, the other resting gently on Kayla's shoulder. Tasha stood just behind him, her eyes darting toward the doorway as the tension in the room reached its breaking point. Within seconds, the door was flung open and two sharply dressed men in tailored suits stepped inside, their badges already held high FBI. The taller of the two announced, his tone cold and deliberate. He scanned the room before locking his gaze on Marcus. "Agent Johnson, are you all right?" For the first time since his arrest, Marcus allowed himself to exhale. "I'm fine," he said evenly, though his heart was still hammering. "My family's been through hell, though." The agent's eyes moved immediately to Tasha and the children, who clung to Marcus with wide, frightened eyes. "Get them out of here," Marcus instructed softly, and one of the agents nodded, gesturing for Tasha to follow him into the hallway where a pair of FBI escorts were waiting to take her and the kids to a safe room. The moment they were gone, Marcus turned his attention to the officers, who now looked like cornered animals. "What is going on here?" the shorter FBI agent demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "Why was our agent detained without probable cause?" No one answered. The shaved-head officer, who had spent hours barking orders and accusations at Marcus, opened his mouth but nothing came out. He was visibly shaken, beads of sweat forming along his brow. The taller FBI agent stepped closer to him, his expression icy. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? You unlawfully detained a federal agent, terrorized his family, and violated every protocol of due process." His voice rose with each word, reverberating off the cold walls of the station. "We want every second of body camera footage, every piece of documentation, and every officer involved in this farce accounted for." Now, Daniels, the younger officer who had quietly shown Marcus's kindness earlier, shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Marcus. He looked pale, as though he wished he could disappear. The shaved-head officer finally found his voice, though it cracked when he spoke. We had a bolo on a stolen vehicle. Their SUV matched the description. It was standard procedure. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Standard procedure. You pulled guns on my children. You handcuffed me on the ground in front of them without a single piece of evidence. You ignored my wife when she begged you to check the rental papers. That wasn't standard procedure, that was profiling. The man flinched as Marcus's words cut into him like a whip. And when I told you I was cooperating, you mocked me. You think that's justifiable? The silence that followed was deafening. The taller FBI agent broke it by turning to Daniels, his officer, who authorized this arrest. Daniels hesitated, then glanced at the shaved-head officer. He did, he said quietly. The man's face went red. Daniels, you little. Enough, the agent barked. This department will answer for this. I'm contacting the U.S. Attorney's Office, and you can expect an internal affairs investigation by the end of the day. He turned to Marcus. Agent Johnson will be filing formal charges against the officers involved. You and your family will be fully debriefed and will make sure you have the support you need. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. He was grateful, but the ache in his chest reminded him that nothing could undo what his children had endured. He could still see Jordan's tear-streaked face pressed against the window of that squad car, Kayla's tiny hands trembling in fear. Those images would haunt him long after this was over. As the FBI agents took control of the scene, several officers began scrambling, their faces pale as reality set in. Files were collected, body camera footage secured, and the names of every officer present were taken down. Daniel stood quietly to the side, looking ashamed. Marcus approached him slowly. "Thank you for letting me see my family," he said, softly. Daniels nodded, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, sir. I should have done more." Marcus gave a small nod. "Then do better next time." He left Daniels with those words and stepped out into the hallway where Tasha, Kayla, and Jordan were waiting with the FBI escorts. Tasha rushed into his arms the moment she saw him, her face pressed into his chest as if she could finally breathe. Again, Kayla and Jordan clung to his legs, their tiny bodies shaking with relief. Marcus knelt down, hugging all three of them as tightly as he could. "We're going home," he whispered. "This is over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't truly over. What had happened here was bigger than just their family, and Marcus had no intention of letting it slide. He looked over his shoulder at the agents standing behind him. "I want to be involved in the investigation," he said firmly. "I want to make sure this department answers for everything they've done." The taller agent nodded without hesitation. "Will make it happen. Agent Johnson, you have my word." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, not just for justice, but for change. The following weeks were a blur of interviews, legal proceedings, and media attention that Marcus could never have anticipated. The video footage taken by bystanders during the arrest had gone viral within days, spreading across every major social media platform and eventually landing on national news. Clips of officers pointing guns at Tasha and the children, Marcus face down on the pavement in handcuffs, and the audible sobs of Kayla and Jordan struck a nerve with millions of viewers. Headlines blared with outrage, and civil rights leaders demanded answers. For Marcus, the media storm was secondary to the quiet healing that needed to happen within his own family. At night, Jordan still woke screaming from nightmares, clutching his father's shirt as if afraid he would vanish again. Kayla, usually bubbly and talkative, had become quieter, more watchful. Marcus and Tasha did their best to reassure them, talking openly about what had happened and reminding them that it wasn't their fault. But even as he comforted his children, Marcus knew he could not let this incident fade into another headline that would be forgotten in a week. He threw himself into the investigation, working closely with the FBI's Internal Affairs Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office to hold the department accountable. Every officer involved in his wrongful arrest was called to testify, and the mountain of evidence, including the body camera footage and the testimony of bystanders, was damning. The shaved-head officer, whose name was revealed as Sergeant Keller, was suspended without pay pending termination and faced possible federal charges for civil rights violations. Several other officers received suspensions and were required to undergo intensive bias and de-escalation training. Officer Daniels, who had shown moments of hesitation during the ordeal, came forward during the investigation and admitted the department had a long history of targeting minorities under the guise of routine stops. His testimony was a turning point that led to a full federal review of the department's practices. The changes that followed were unprecedented. New leadership was appointed, body camera usage policies were rewritten, and a community oversight board was established to monitor the department's actions moving forward. Yet even as systemic reforms began to take shape, Marcus felt the weight of what had been lost. He and Tasha decided to take the children back to the beach one final time, months after the incident, not to erase the memory but to reclaim the space where their family's joy had been stolen. The drive was eerily familiar, the same stretches of highway and roadside billboards, but this time there was no tension in the air, no fear of flashing lights in the rearview mirror. When they arrived, the sun was warm and the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom. Kayla and Jordan ran ahead with their buckets and shovels, just as they had before, but this time their laughter was genuine, no longer shadowed by the fear of that day. Tasha spread a blanket on the sand while Marcus stood for a moment, staring out at the endless horizon. He thought about the journey they had taken since that morning in the parking lot, about how close they had come to becoming just another statistic. He thought about the countless other families who had not been as fortunate, whose stories had ended in tragedy instead of survival. Tasha came up behind him and slipped her hand into his. "We're still standing," she said softly. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the children as they built an elaborate sandcastle together, their small hands working furiously in the golden light. "We are," he agreed. "But we have a responsibility now." He knew their family's ordeal, that had become a symbol, one that carried the weight of a much larger fight for justice. Marcus had already begun speaking at community events and schools, sharing their story not to relive the pain but to shine a light on the reality of racial profiling and abuse of power. He wanted people to see Kayla and Jordan's faces and understand that behind every headline was a family forever changed. As the sun began to set, casting the beach in a warm orange glow, Marcus knelt beside his children, helping them dig a moat around their sand. Jordan looked up at him, his eyes bright for the first time in weeks. "Daddy, it's the biggest castle ever," he exclaimed. Marcus smiled and kissed the top of his son's head. "It sure is, buddy," he said. Tasha joined them, wrapping her arms around Marcus's shoulders as they watched the tide slowly creep closer. For the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus felt a sense of peace. They had survived, they had fought back, and while the road ahead would be long, they were stronger than ever together. As the waves crashed gently against the shore, erasing the footprints in the sand, Marcus knew their story would not be forgotten. It would stand as a reminder, a call for change, and a promise that his family's pain would lead to something greater. The Johnson family, once victims, had become a beacon, and their light would not be extinguished. If this story moved you, please like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to The Black Struggle on YouTube for more powerful stories and voices that matter.